welcome back to our special here on the First TV, the worst presidents in American history. I want to go to Dr. Paul Moreno. He's a professor of history at the wonderful Hillsdale College. Dr. Moreno, how are you, sir?
Well, very, very good. Thanks. Great to be here.
I'm grateful you're here. So my understanding is we have 3 additions to this list. Let's go in chronological order. What do you think about Woodrow Wilson?
He was, in many ways, perhaps the worst president in all of American history because he was the first one to fundamentally undermine the constitutional nature of the American presidency and to change it. Going back to the 1870s, Wilson was an academic for decades before he went into politics. And he wrote some of the most important and fundamental works criticizing the American Constitution.
Can you give me an example of what did he not like about the Constitution?
Oh, well, he wrote one of the first essays about the administrative state. It was called The Study of Administration in the first or second volume of the American Political Science Review. And basically he said that the United States doesn't have a European-style centralized bureaucratic state, and we need one. So right there, he sort of laid the groundwork for the whole 20th century administrative state, the swamp, the very thing that President-elect Trump is dedicated to doing something about. So he's really taking on something that began to be built by Woodrow Wilson, in the middle of the 19th century.
What was Wilson's worldview that had him think we should take on more the European style and have this animosity towards the Constitution as it was and had been?
It was very common among the group of people who would come to be called progressives. That the United States had entered a new era, that the Industrial Revolution, the Urban Revolution, the modern world meant that the old Constitution that the framers gave us was out of date and obsolete. And that's another one of Wilson's fundamental contributions, was the idea of the living Constitution, the idea that the founders' principles we've outgrown them, that the Constitution was fine for the 18th century when we were a country of 4 million people, mostly farmers. But the world has changed, and the Constitution has to change with it. So Wilson's basically a historicist or a relativist who believes that there are no permanent, self-evident truths in politics or anything else for that matter, that our ideas and our institutions have to evolve along with changing social circumstances. So if you say something like all men are created equal, that might be sometimes, but maybe not at other times. So Wilson really just undermined the entire intellectual world and assumptions, the sort of classical liberalism, the natural rights philosophy of the American founding. He was a very profound challenge to the founding.
How did he win? Did he make those arguments at the time?
That's where moving from political theory to political history is really interesting because Wilson, again, he had this long academic paper trail, but it really didn't come up in his political career. He went from being the president of Princeton University in 1910 to one term as governor of New Jersey, and then he went right into the national arena in 1912. And he won that election only because the Republican Party had split. Theodore Roosevelt and the incumbent, William Howard Taft, had a falling out, and so they divided the Republican vote, and Wilson was able to win with about 40% of the national popular vote. He didn't win a single state outside of the old Confederacy, so he really wasn't any stronger than any of the preceding Democratic presidents, some of whom Miles Smith talked about, like Grover Cleveland. But he was able to take advantage of this occasional fracturing of the Republican Party. And the one who really should have noted this was William Howard Taft, who was relatively conservative. Theodore Roosevelt was very progressive himself, and Wilson ends up doing a lot of what Theodore Roosevelt had called for in the election of 1912. But Taft, as a constitutionalist, should have noticed, but for various reasons, one of which was Taft thought that Roosevelt was more of a threat to the American Constitution than Wilson was. And based on Wilson's campaigning in 1912, there was reason to believe that. In some ways, Wilson presented himself as the most traditionalist or conservative of the 3 candidates. I think if I'd been voting in 1912, I might have voted for Wilson.
Interesting. The deceit. It goes back a ways too. I want to keep talking about it, but we should move on to the other 2. If we were talking about these presidential lists that come out, they rank the best and worst presidents, like 4 of them that always come out. And all these lists put FDR as the best. They put him above Washington, above Lincoln. They put him as the best president. Why do you make the case that FDR was one of our worst?
partly this is because I think the reason FDR gets the accolades that he does is mostly because of World War II, that he was the president who oversaw the war effort during what we still consider to be the good war. If it hadn't been for that, if FDR had ended his presidency after 2 terms, as was the tradition, he would have been considered a failed president. You know, the Depression was still going on. The New Deal really didn't work economically, although it did put together a new coalition in the Democratic Party. But most of all, the reason I think he's a failure, a bad president, was because of his continuation of this progressive undermining of the constitutional assumptions of the United States. Because FDR went further than Wilson. If you look at what Wilson actually did, you got the Federal Reserve Act, you got the first income tax, you got the Federal Trade Commission, but really nothing that was sort of radically new compared to earlier reforms of the American political economy. With FDR, you get the beginning of the entitlement state, of the centralized bureaucratic state of the kind that we're dealing with today. Social Security is the mother of all the entitlement programs. I think the biggest one of all was the National Labor Relations Act, which made organized labor the most powerful interest group in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And Roosevelt had more ambitious plans to centralize the bureaucratic state under the president's control. The wheels fell off of that, though, because he very foolishly took on the Supreme Court. The court was standing in the way of some of the New Deal programs. And after he won re-election in 1936, FDR very deviously launched this plan to allow Congress to let him add 6 justices to the court. And it was so shocking and so transparently political that Congress began to resist and push back. And that was pretty much the end of the New Deal.
Wow. What was his worldview? Why did he think that this was the way to go?
Yeah, FDR, if anything, is even more mysterious than Woodrow Wilson because he had no academic background. Most people regarded FDR as being just a lightweight. I think Oliver Wendell Holmes said he was a first-class temperament and a second-class intellect. That he had political instincts, but he really had no philosophy, no ideology. Now, some political theorists have challenged this, and they said that if you look at some of his speeches, especially the Commonwealth Club address that he gave in 1932, just before he won the election, he really did have this vision of what he called the era of enlightened administration. Again, continuing very much on Wilsonian lines, that the time had come to replace the old, essentially business elite of the sort of classical liberal period with the administrative state, with people who were, came out of the American universities. Roosevelt had the brain trust, people especially from Columbia University who were his advisors, and people who would staff these agencies, the experts, the scientists of their day. And so Roosevelt, I think, was continuing along Wilsonian lines in trying to create what today is referred to as the administrative state.
That's amazing that we're still fighting these battles today. But maybe this is the time to uproot all of this once and for all. We'll see how far Vivek and Elon can go. I'm sensing a theme here, perhaps, with our third suggestion as well. Where's LBJ fit in this list?
Yes, in fact, the political scientist Charles Kessler wrote a book called I Am the Change about Obama and the 4th wave of progressivism. And essentially the 3 that I picked were the first 3 waves: Wilson and the Progressives, FDR and the New Deal, and then Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Johnson, very self-consciously, he just wanted to outdo FDR. He recognized that the New Deal had been stalled by, again, the collapse of Roosevelt's domestic policy and then by America's international commitments and Eisenhower, the hiatus in the 1950s. But when liberalism made a comeback with JFK's election, and especially Johnson's landslide victory in 1964, he wanted to complete the New Deal. And so things like Medicare and Medicaid especially, which were just extensions to Social Security, as Obamacare was an extension to Medicare and Medicaid. Of course, there's the civil rights legislation and the beginnings of affirmative action that you had in the Johnson administration, the beginning of a whole new area of policy that didn't concern so much economics and business. Most progressive regulation had been about regulating big business. But this was the beginnings of what we call today identity politics. The civil rights movement, feminist claims that begin to sort of piggyback onto civil rights, the homosexual rights movement by the end of the 1960s. These are all really offshoots of Great Society legislation that trying to regulate in a new kind of way. Environmental regulation, doing things like workplace safety and the environment, which cover just every aspect of people's lives. The 1960s was the real beginning of a federal government that ordinary people would notice, affecting their everyday lives.
Wow. Okay. So what do you think these three men, and our next guest is going to talk about Obama, so you can include him here if you want, but what do you think these three men missed? Like, what were they missing about what you and I would value in this country or of our Constitution that led them to go a totally different way?
Yeah, in fact, this is probably true of just about every American president going into the 20th century. Maybe the last constitutional president was Calvin Coolidge, somebody who really understood and was dedicated to and could speak about and could articulate the principles of the American founding. This is partly a failure of the educational system in the United States. It's partly a result of the way that American politics had developed. Very gradually, you ended up replacing, again, Miles Smith talked about this, where the founders expected that Congress would be the most important part of the government because that was the part of the government that was closest to the people, and in a republic, the people are sovereign. The presidency began to eclipse the legislature in the 20th century, and these presidents were a product of that. They just sort of took for granted the principles of progressivism and New Deal liberalism, that the president is the center of the government. And a part of the reason why they all ran up against significant opposition was all the things that the federal government tries to do in the 20th century are just impossible for one person to manage. The tasks that the federal government was supposed to undertake under the Constitution were very limited. Most of them had to do with foreign policy and sort of genuinely interstate things. Domestic matters, or what were called in constitutional law the police power, was supposed to be left to the states. And so the centralizing of the government in the federal government, removing the place that the states had in this, and then within the federal government, centralizing power in the office of the presidency just became an impossible task.
Amazing. We just talked recently with one of your colleagues at Hillsdale, who's an expert in the Gilded Age. So we spoke a bit about that era where the presidency was of less importance than the legislative branch. Maybe one day we can get back to that. I got about 60 seconds. Let's go back to maybe to Wilson, but all these guys, and today, who think that we have a living Constitution. What is your response to the people who believe that, or that the Constitution is no longer relevant because we're not a bunch of farmers anymore?
Well, certainly, I mean, the Constitution has a mechanism for adapting itself to change circumstances, the amendment process. And the progressives should have been very aware of this because there were, probably 4 amendments that bore the fingerprints of the progressive movement. The direct election of senators, the income tax, prohibition, and women's suffrage. And it's notable that, especially during the New Deal, you don't see any formal change in the Constitution. It was all done informally. Apart from the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms, which probably wasn't a good idea.
Dr. Paul Moreno, professor of history at the wonderful Hillsdale College. Dr. Moreno, great to talk to you, sir. Thanks for your insight.
Thanks again for having me.